Welcome to our Integral Love Relationship Web Jam. My name is Martin Utschig, and I'm your host and the author of two books, Integral Relationships, A Manual for Men, and Sex, Purpose, Love, Couples in Integral Relationships, Creating a Better World. Welcome, everyone. So this is a basic image which represents the purpose of this web jam and my work. Is basically to empower us, to educate us, to inspire us to create love relationships that are based in intimacy, passion, and commitment at the bottom, and that we learn to love not only our partner, which is often the premise of normal relationships, regular relationships, but that we even more so love what is co-created between the two of us at the level of all 7 chakras. So I need to switch back to let's see how I can go to the next slide. There we go. So to show that in a little bit more, in an integral way, if we look at the center where the hearts were before, go back, here you see the hearts in an integral way, and we will cover that in the next few sessions. There are what we call the 4 quadrants, and they are balanced and harmonized by feminine and masculine polarity. So that will be the depth that we will go into as we move along with our Saturday jams. And then we will also cover, of course, the levels of development that are in each of these quadrants. And where we want to start this from or look at from is that since we want to create a better world, we want to change behavior, we want to inspire people to create these kind of relationships, we're still focused on point 1 in this list. Why does that matter to begin with? Why do healthy relationships and healthy families matter for creating a better world? And then hopefully that will lead us to people want to create these kinds of relationships. And then we're going to go into what to do to create these kinds of integral relationships that make the world a better place, and then how to do. In our web jam last week, we covered that, oh, my phone is ringing. I'll turn this off. Ugh. Bear with me for a second. All right. We covered that all reality is created of what we call holons, or better said, it's co-created. So if you for a moment feel into your body, maybe even close your eyes or look at the bottom of the image that you see on the screen, you see that subatomic particles in your body, some people say stardust, co-create atoms. And these atoms have, for a reason nobody really understands, a co-creative drive to love each other, to co-create with each other, to co-create molecules. And these molecules in your body create cells, and they create tissue, co-create tissues. The tissues co-create organs. And then there you are as a human being sitting here watching this show right now. And very often in my meditation, or always in my meditation, I start with deeply connecting with this aliveness in my body, down to every organ, every tissue, every cell, every molecule, any atom, subatomic particles. It's just a total miracle that our bodies are functioning, hopefully for all of you, well, without us really doing anything. And then this so-called holarchy continues, where humans have this drive, mainly experienced through our sex drive, to co-create couples. And when we fall in love with each other, that's probably, besides the bond with a child, the deepest bond that humans can experience. And of course, it gives us amazing feelings when we just fell in love, which is driven by hormones, and the sky is the limit, and we just feel like we're reborn and we're in a totally new state. of mind and joy and happiness and fulfillment. And the downside, of course, is that when a deeply soul level, deep committed love relationship with deep intimacy and passion and commitment breaks up, that this is probably also, besides maybe losing a child or being diagnosed with a terminal disease, the deepest pain that humans can experience. So there is the deepest bond. And then that goes to the next level of the family. And of course, families also experience a deep bond, but for most people, it's less of a bond that they experience with their primary partner. And then families create communities. And again, there is less of a bond that we usually experience with our community than we experience with our family or our couples, our partner. And then there is society and humanity. So the further up we go in that hierarchy, the less of a bond we usually experience. And as we said last time, in ideal society, there is, if we look above the line, there is what we call an ideal span, the number of people that are there. So there's, of course, the greatest number is on individuals, then there's fewer couples, fewer families, fewer communities, a few societies, and then one humanity at the top. And in our modern and postmodern cultures, we usually give the greatest depth to the individual human being. That was not always so. In history, there was usually the greatest depth was given to the couple, but that shifted during the Enlightenment period about 300 years ago, where we started to put the individual in the center of the universe. It started with Descartes, I think, therefore I am, or I doubt, therefore I am. And this has led to societies where we see fewer couples and even fewer families and fewer stable, homogeneous communities. And that has been pointed out by many people, and we will look at that a little bit more, that this has created all kinds of societal problems in our world. So where we want to go with this whole series is that we want to go back to giving the couple the greatest depth, and then hopefully that will eventually lead to that we're moving back towards this ideal span, that we have more predominantly healthy couples in our societies, and then healthy families, thriving communities, and a more peaceful, thriving society. So last time in our last web jam, and you can look that up on my website, integralrelationship.com, and we watched that series. We talked a lot about the advantages on a couple level over being single. That had to do with our own well-being in a coupled relationship, and the importance, again, for society. And today I want to add another spin to it, which was inspired by Professor Feldman and by Jürgen Habermas. And I'm going to explain that slide for a moment. So at the bottom, we see that humans emerged obviously out of the natural world. We're connected with the natural world, like all other mammals and animals or living things are part of the natural world and emerge out of the natural world. And males and females, before humans became self-conscious, they lived what Professor Feldman calls, they lived kind of side by side, like other great apes or other animals do. So obviously they interacted with each other, but there wasn't much or no self-awareness, and the connection was driven by impulses, by primal impulses to survive, for food, for safety, for sex. And then through the exclusive pair bond and through sexual relationships that became monogamous, and sexuality was not only performed for procreation, but also for enjoyment and for well-being and for creating a deeper connection, humans started to become self-conscious and evolved into what we call in indigo language, into the magic stage, where they then started to form families and tribal communities. And for many thousand years, these tribes just roamed the world and eventually populated the whole world. And then about 6,000-7,000 years ago, with agriculture and people settling down, mainly in the Mediterranean, systems of power and money started to emerge, and which we see at the top of that slide. And these systems of power and money, and now in the modern world of the media and politics and corporations and everything, that is not part of what Habermas calls the life world, where humans interact directly with each other outside these systems of power and money. They were initially in service of the communities, the families, and the tribes. They really helped to organize life, to make life more coordinated, to make life easier for everyone, or for most people at least. But then eventually they became so powerful that they also started to, what Habermas calls, encroach on the individual and the families, and started to take their freedom and their liberation, their liberties away. But as long as people were in families and in healthy communities, they still created, these families and communities created a buffer towards the individual. In other words, there was still, the family to come home, the community to come home. People were supporting each other on that level. If there were any hardships, people could support each other, and they were, as individuals, less affected and exposed to the system, as long as they lived in a family and in a healthy community, which is at the center of this image. Now, when in modern societies, or in the modern world, when people become single and fall out of the circle in the middle, then they become directly exposed to the systems of power and money, and very often they also become dependent on these systems. For example, a very simple example, if I'm in my family environment, have a partner, and I get sick, it's very likely that my family, my partner, will take care of me. If I'm single, then I'm dependent on maybe friends that help me. But as we saw earlier, friendships are not as close-knit, as deeply connected as we are with our partner and our family. And then, we may have to go to the emergency room. We have to get an Uber car to get there if we don't drive. And there are many, many examples where singles are much more exposed to and dependent on the system than people who live in healthy families, in healthy communities. So that kind of concludes the overall arguments from last week's session and what I just shared about the benefits of being in a healthy relationship. And now I want to briefly talk about consciousness and procreation. And so to start with that, I will explain this slide here. So about 3 million years ago, at the bottom left, we saw that the first hominids emerged on the planet, and they got all extinct over the course of evolution. So there are no more Neanderthals and Homo erectus and all these different types of hominids that roam the earth. About 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens, our species, emerged. And they formed these magical tribes, which were mainly driven by superstitious thinking, by fear, about nature and by survival. So surviving, sex, that was the main drive of these humans. And they, at one point, from all the hominids, reached more than 10%. That's that double line at the bottom. And if you look to the right, there is still a certain percentage, let's say about 15%, who live in that kind of magical tribal belief system, worldview, state of mind in our modern societies. Then about 100,000 years, what we call the egocentric stage emerged. This is when probably very powerful driven males broke out from these tribal structures, and instead of being controlled by their environment, they wanted to control their environment. And they also then at one point reached a critical mass of 10%. And in today's society, if you look at the right, we have about 20% of people in that stage. And the important part to notice here is that people in the egocentric stage who procreated, their children usually had a higher survival rate than the children of people who remained in the magical tribal stage of consciousness, because they just protected themselves better, and they were more aggressive in providing food. They were more aggressive in pursuing more attractive females, these egocentric males, and attractive females usually give birth to healthier children, so they had higher survival rates than people in the magical stage. Then about 10,000 years ago, the mythic amber stage emerged. That's associated with agriculture, with land ownership, with no longer being hunters and gatherers, but growing their own food. So eventually there was a surplus of food supply, which allowed people in that stage, which were mainly farmers and artisans, and then monotheistic religions emerged and so on and so forth, to have higher survival rates. More children survived, people got older. And so when the mythic stage went over 10%, we saw an increase in population, a steep increase in population. And the mythic stage, obviously, the food that was produced and the rules that were created, they also benefited people in the egocentric and in the magical stage, so their birth rates increased as well. Then about 300 years ago, the industrial urge, modernity, the Enlightenment began. And that, of course, created many benefits for humans to have higher survival rates. Fertilizers were created, much more food could be produced, diseases could be cured, and so on and so forth. And the rational stage also then lifted up people who were still in the mythic stage and pulled up people who were in the egocentric magical stage. And there were way more people, survived. So in today's society, we see about 50% of people in that mythic stage. And then, as we can see, until about 40 years ago, people in the rational stage also grew in numbers. And then something, or let's follow the rational stage. And something interesting happened around 1970. Humans invented the birth control pill. Women had more choice to have children or not, which was also socially and culturally acceptable. And having sex, children were no longer necessarily a consequence of having sex. And that led to a decline in birth rates of people in the rational stage. So while they were probably at around 40% of the population in the 70s and 80s, we see a decline of people in the rational stage. Then about 60 years ago, the pluralistic green stage emerged, which we see at the bottom right. And these people had much fewer children than people in the rational and in the mythic and egocentric and magical stage. And they never really reached the 10% threshold that is usually necessary for a new worldview to catch on and trickle down or be adopted by a majority of the population, as was the case with the mythic and irrational and all these other stages. And then about 30 years ago, the integral stage emerged, and that only reached about 1 or 2% of the population, and integral people are probably procreating even less than pluralistic green people. So here are a few slides, and there are more statistics in my book, Sex, Purpose, Love. And this is obviously open for discussion, but I'm just showing a few things about fertility rates in the Western world, or in America. Poor people, 2.4 children, working class, 1.8 children, middle and upper class, 1.7 children per woman. Here we see education and the use of birth control. So 55% with a bachelor's or higher use birth control. High school degree or less, only 19%. Here we see the family paths. Poor people often only 16% marry first, and then and 61% have children first and then marry, and 23% don't marry. And then in middle and upper class, 51% marry first before they have children. 19% have children first. And so if we go back to that's this slide here real quick, we obviously see that consciousness up to the rational stage was always evolving, and cultural, we call that cultural evolution. People became increasingly conscious. And in one of the next sessions, we will be more clear what consciousness development means. And because, as I said before, that was because the more conscious people became, the better tools they had to deal with their environment, and their children had higher survival rates. And so this curve, or what we call the center of gravity, where most people were in this consciousness hierarchy from the magical to the integral, always kept moving to the right. And until a few years ago, most researchers assumed that this movement to the right will continue, because what they did not look at was that birth rates were declining the more conscious that people became. And unfortunately, we don't have educational systems in place in most countries of the world to help children who are born into families of lower consciousness to advance into levels of higher consciousness. So here are more statistics that show how the world population will evolve. So we see at the left side 2010, and on the right side 2050, the predictions. And we see that in absolute numbers on the left and in percentage of the population, that people with predominantly mythic belief systems, for example here Christians and Muslims, will increase in population, because, as we saw earlier, mythic people have way more children than rational and pluralistic children. In percentage, it looks a little different here. The Muslims are the one that will, the part of the population that will have the biggest growth, while the religiously unaffiliated agnostics or atheists, will shrink in percentage. In absolute numbers, they grow a little bit. Hindus will stay about the same. And then the religions that are typically associated with higher consciousness, they will shrink or will stay the same. So very often when I share this with people, they say, well, I don't have children, or I don't think humans should have children. We should work on raising consciousness on the planet. And that is a really good idea that I basically share. But the problem is that we're dissociating consciousness evolution from biological evolution. And as we see in the statistics and as we see in the world, if there is a small percentage of people, let's say 2-5% of humanity, who try to raise consciousness on the planet, it just doesn't trickle down or affect the rest of the population. We see the same in the United States, even though the number of Christians may slightly shrink and the number of the unaffiliated, which are typically in the rational stage, may slightly increase. All the other religions that are usually working on consciousness raising on the planet will approximately stay the same. Now, there is one important thing to know when we look at religions is that not all people who are, let's say, Muslim or Christian or in conventional monotheistic religions are in the mythic stage. This is a chart from the book Why Religion Matters by Houston Smith, and he found out or postulated that each religion has 4 levels. An atheist level, people who only believe in material objects in their own subjective experience. Then people who are polytheistic, who have multiple gods. People who are in the third ring monotheistic, believe in a creator who created the world, the typical Christian and dogmatic religious beliefs. And then mystics who are seeing God in everything. But typically, again, there's only a small percentage of mystics in each religion. So we cannot say per se that a religious believer is necessarily in a mythic stage of consciousness. This is another image that I often like to show when we talk about birth rates. And here we see all the blue countries have less than 2 children per woman on average. So all their populations are shrinking unless they have immigration. The green countries have 2 to 3 children per woman. The yellow countries, 3 to 4 children per woman. Then 4 to 5, the orange, 5 to 6, the dark red countries. So we see that the further south we go, and into developing countries, the more children are born there. And the more evolved or in cultural evolution, the more industrialized countries become, their birth rates are going down. There's also an interesting statistic. There we see on the left, we see the number of children or the energy consumption. And on the left side, we see the total fertility rate. So what we see here is that the lesser children there are in societies. So if you look at the bottom, the higher their energy consumption is. So some people say, we need to have fewer children to solve our energy problems and our environmental problems. But that doesn't really hold up, because people in industrial nations who have fewer children, they also consume way more energy. And of course, a 1-person household consumes much more energy than a 4-person household. And we're coming pretty close to the end of my presentation. So there's 15 global challenges that, according to the Millennium Project, that humanity is facing. So I'll just lift it up for a moment so you can look at it. So clean water, democratization, rich-poor gap, health issues, peace and conflict, status of women, and so on and so forth. And there's like 3 views on the world. One view is that everything is getting worse in the world. And one view is that everything is getting better in the world. And one view is that everything is perfect the way it is, kind of like a more spiritual view. And if you look a little closer, all of these 3 views are correct. So if you look at at these predictions here in multiple areas, this goes from 1995 to 2025, is that in many areas like poverty and foreign direct investment, freedom, women in national parliament, school enrollment, electricity from renewable energies, water, improved water resources, physicians per people, and mortality rates, and so on and so forth. These things are all predicted to improve in the future. And these are the things that are predicted to worsen in the future: unemployment, fossil fuel consumption, renewal, internal freshwater resources, forested area, biocapacity per capita, terrorism incident, income inequality, number of wars and conflicts, corruption. So part of the world is getting better, part of the world is getting worse. And the interesting thing, if we look a little deeper at these two statistics, is that we see that these things are mainly addressed by people in the mythic and organizations in the mythic and in the rational stage. So while the things that are getting worse are created by the improvements that are made here. So Jürgen Habermas and many people have adopted that, like Ken Wilber said, that each higher stage of consciousness solves the problem of the previous stage, but creates new problems that increase in complexity. And in the past, what that meant is that the mythic stage solved the problems that were created in the egocentric stage by creating more order and so on and so forth. But it created its own problems, like repression of people, repression of women, and so on and so forth, which the rational stage, with the liberation of people and democracies and technology, solved the problems of the mythic stage, but created its own problems: upward distribution of wealth and environmental destruction, to name two, and big wars with mass extinction, which in theory the green stage, the next emerging stage, would solve. But since there are less than 10% of the population in the green stage, they usually have little impact on solving the problems of that are created at the orange level. And so these are the problems that usually are addressed by people at the pluralistic, postmodern, and higher stages, which isn't really being efficiently addressed because, as we saw before, these people procreate much less and form fewer families. And so that's my point, why co-creation and procreation and healthy families who create healthy communities matter, and why it matters that people who are at higher levels of development have at least as many children as people at earlier levels of development. And that, in my opinion, can be achieved by educating people, inspiring people to create integral relationships at all levels of development, to share a purpose, have a shared purpose in their relationship, no matter at what level they are, create integral love relationships at any level of consciousness, and what I call number 4, have compassionate, rational, communicative action between males and females with equal rights and responsibilities in the private and public sphere. So these are the things that we're going to go into over the next few months. So I'm going to stop the slide presentation and look at some of the comments. So there are a few questions. Keith, you can see that the comment from Professor Feldman is all the way at the bottom of the comment section on the right. And I want to invite one or a few of you. At the top of the screen, there is a little hand where you can make a speak request. And when you make that speak request, what will happen is that there will be a tiny plugin downloaded to your browser, and then your camera and your microphone is tested, and then you can come online and we can have a conversation. So while I'll wait for someone to come online, or for a few people to come online, Dorwin asks, thanks so much for your in-depth work on this. Where are the percentages on the number of people at different stages coming from? Well, they come from looking, for example, at voting patterns. You know, how many people in different countries vote for the Green Party. In the US, obviously, we have a two-party system, and then each party has certain, left and centrist and right-leaning wings. In Europe, it's a little more interesting to look at that, because in Germany, for example, we have 6 parties in the parliament right now, and each party more or less represents some, a certain stage. So we can see in Europe, for example, that the Green parties typically, even though they're around for about 20, 30 years, never went above 10% of the population. And the other ways of looking at that is just looking into the world and at statistics to see how many people share which kind of views. So obviously that's a topic open for discussion, and I see we have 2 speaking requests, so I'll accept Derwin into the room. And Eleni is calling from Greece, so we should see them in a moment while they test their camera and download their the little app. So, and then of course, Spiral Dynamics, they have given some numbers. Ken Wilber has given some numbers, but I mainly look at voting patterns and in that context, and just and looking at memberships of certain groups and so on and so forth to come up with these numbers. And again, what seems to be very evident is when we look at educational levels, if we look at income, if we look at voting patterns again, we can see, that the more evolved people become, the less they procreate. Hello, Dorwin, can you turn on your camera and your microphone? There he is. We can see you, but we cannot hear you.
Okay, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Very good. Sorry, I missed your webinar last week with Heidi and Mark.
No problem. While I was testing, I missed the last thing you said, though.
Yes.
I'm in the process of installing, so I might be a bit behind.
Yeah. Well, I tried to address your question. I think my main point about, it's of course, we're not precise with these numbers.
Yeah.
And there is also pockets, obviously, in Northern California, there are more people in the green stage, or in Boulder, and in Kansas or whatever, in the southern stage, there's more people in the mythic stage. In Europe, it's interesting. I'm familiar with German politics. We have 6 parties right now in the government, and they all more or less represent a different stage of development. And the Green Party, for example, over 30 years, they never exceeded like 10% of the votes.
The Green Party?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But okay, so do you think most people at the Green level vote in the Green Party, though? Or because I don't know, because in Canada, I would say that wouldn't necessarily be the case. They would maybe vote, in another kind of left for center party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, political systems are very difficult. Of course, in the US, a lot of people don't vote for the Green Party who share the Green Party values, because they see it as a lost vote, and so they vote for the Democrats. While in Germany, the Green Party is in the parliament, and so it makes a lot of sense to vote for the Green Party if you share their values, which are oriented for humanistic values and environmental issues.
Okay. Right, okay.
That's, I think, true in the UK and in other countries as well. So it's interesting to look at the statistics, and also that they did not increase, in the last 30 years. So they kind of like showed up on the political scene very quickly and then stayed more or less consistent, stable over 30 years.
And you're saying part of the reason for that is because there's so many fewer children that people have had.
Yes.
And so
I mean, there is no direct statistics that I found, if Green Party voters, how many children they have. But in the US, I didn't pull up these statistics, but you can find them on the internet. You clearly see that people who vote Republican and are in blue states, they have about 3 children, between 2 and 3 children on average, while people who vote Democrat and are in blue states, they have between 1 and 2 children. So people who vote Democrat have fewer children than people who vote Republican. That's undisputed and totally consistent. Right? So Utah has the highest number of children, and I forgot New York, or where the big cities are, they have the fewest. And it's just like staggering, that people like Habermas and until recently Ken Wilber and others, were still sort of like thinking, or Steve McIntosh, that there is something like an evolutionary impulse that's independent of procreation, and that, cultural evolution or evolution in consciousness driven by some kind of, metaphysical power or drive, that we will continue in this, cultural evolution, which will then solve the problems of the previous stage. And what people are not looking at is that there was this incredible fulcrum 40 years ago where we became the first species on the planet in 3 billion years of biological evolution who figured out how to have sex without getting pregnant. And nobody can tell me that when we look back in 2,000 years, not we, but future generations at human evolution, right, they will probably note our time as the biggest fulcrum, when that shift happened of having sex without getting pregnant.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and that is a big concern, not only for me. Of course, there's other people who kind of indirectly see that. They just don't use the terms that we integral people use, like conscious stages of consciousness and things like that.
Right, and that would be maybe the Dr. Feldman that you mentioned and stuff. And or someone mentioned, would maybe just improving the education system significantly? The funny thing I'm aware of that maybe, and this is a very small sample, of course, so it's not representative, but the boomer parents, so like I'm an only child, but I have 3 kids, and a number of my friends who all grew up together in a spiritual community that I grew up in, who all pretty much have we're all pretty much only children or have maybe 1 sibling, have all ended up having 3 kids. One of them has 4.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a little mini boom that's kind of been happening. But that's a pretty small sample, and but it is different they are different from their parents and having more kids again. So yeah. But that's a small sample, and so maybe the improving education is one way, or what you're suggesting people just have more kids?
Well, that is, of course, what's certainly were prosperous for me, because essentially we're telling women, to have more children. Their investment in having children is way bigger than for most men. So this is just, I mean, all I can do is bring awareness to that fact, right? And at least I think I already convinced Ken Wilber and a few other people, Andrew Cohen and so on and so forth, that Andrew will actually be on the show next Saturday, so that will be interesting. That this dissociation from consciousness evolution in the left quadrants, from biological evolution in the right quadrants, is a fallacy, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, absolutely.
And in my book, Sex, Purpose, Love, I spend a lot of time showing, how brains develop, how fetuses develop. So there's already a certain disadvantage of children who are born into lower consciousness families, because they often don't have the nutrition, they don't have the environment, for their bodies to develop in the first during gestation, in the first few years, to even have the potential then to for most of them to grow to higher stages of awareness, to higher stages of complexity, which of course is related to our brains in some way.
Yeah, so for that part, I think better education and social services would be
yes
to go, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, these are usually things that are addressed by people at higher stages of consciousness, and they are smaller numbers. So it's really this like wicked problem of, if you look at the American political system right now, which will hopefully change again, that we're cutting down on social services, that we're cutting down on education, and so on and so forth,
right.
which would help more people. And for those who are interested in that subject, there is a great book that recently came out called Dream Hoarders. So like hoarding dreams, where people at higher levels of education make sure that their children get well educated, which by necessity, so to speak, or the way the education system and communities are structured, prevents children from lower income, lower education families to get into higher education. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, it's a concerning issue for sure.
Yes.
Another wicked problem. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So smaller numbers of people trying to solve those problems that have been created by the larger.
Yes. Yeah. So again, of course, I could go on and on. We're looking at Poland, looking at Turkey, looking at all kinds of, the whole Arab Spring, where basically orange and green had this uprising, right? And then they were just dwarfed by the overwhelming mythic population, who got really scared that this will destabilize the countries. And of course, we see progress in certain areas, like Saudi Arabia. Women are now starting to be allowed to drive and things like that, where mythic kind of pushes into orange, right? But over the next 20, 30 years, hopefully I will see if I'm right or wrong, right? I may be wrong about that, but for now we see more and more countries who were on a way, to more orange and then moving into green, sliding back into these mythic conservative political systems. Brexit in the UK, for example, and just the mythic, and egocentric people outvoting potentially, if there is a charismatic leader like Trump or other people who can rally up these people with simple bumper sticker messages, get them to the polls, they can outvote the more evolved people. That is really, really concerning.
Yes. Great. Well, thanks for this.
And of course, specifically the women who listen to that say, well, yeah, okay. I would be interested in maybe having children once I see, how important that is. But I want to have a guy, I want to have a good man who is a good father, who will share with me responsibilities in the home and in the public sphere. And this is where I'm going with this. For me, that the saving grace around this is this potential for shared purpose. So, and this is where we will go with that, because we still look at relationships in this, like, the calling into one kind of like thing, the perfect man, the perfect woman. And, does he or she meet my needs, and he or she, do we need each other's needs? They're very need-based. And there is this new movement in the new age scene of what is our purpose beyond our biological purpose. So in one of the next sessions, I'm going to talk about when I thought about purpose, the first thing one of the first things I realized is we have two purposes. One is our biological purpose to survive and to procreate and to see quality of life. And then some people awaken to what I call our transcendental purpose, which is more eudaimonic versus hedonistic, which is to create more goodness, truth, beauty, or function in the world, which is genetically encoded.
Mm-hmm.
And as more people awaken to wanting to live their what I call transcendental purpose or higher purpose or soul's purpose or unique purpose, whatever you want to call it,
yes.
that opens a potential for sharing that purpose in a partnership.
Right.
And that creates a new attractor that goes beyond, the typical attractors of power and status and wealth and sexiness and open-heartedness and wisdom. And that, for me, is a potential for creating a new type of relationship that then also will increase a birth rate. So I'm not negative about that. I have sort of and I see a new emergence in humanity around the planet, actually, where people awaken to their purpose and then naturally will have a desire to share that purpose with others. So, but I'm jumping way ahead in the.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks so much. Appreciate having a little bit of sense of the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
that's why I show at the beginning that image of the couple with the hearts in the middle on their chakras, where they not only love each other, but they even more so love what is uniquely co-created between the two of them. And then, of course, if you get feminine and masculine polarities more balanced in what is co-created, and you get it balanced and harmonized in all four quadrants. And this is where I'm basically going with what my book, Sex, Purpose, Love, is about.
Right.
Is first to understand the opposite sex, and which also means to understand yourself, right? To understand men and women from an integral perspective, like my first book. The second part is about how to awaken to and identify and live and share your purpose in a relationship. And the third part is love, which is the shift in love to not only loving the partner, but to love what's uniquely co-created at all the 7 chakras. That's why it's called Sex, Purpose, Love.
Okay, great.
And then making the world a better place is the result of these 3 elements.
I'm interviewing for a social services position this week. It's just a small position, but it's the first position that I've seen that's focused on men as parents, as dads. So encouraging men to be more engaged. And it's possible that your book, at least as a resource for me, and maybe, parts of it or something I could share with the dads, or potentially the agency, the social services agency that's would be sponsoring me if I do this work. So so the timing is good.
Great.
And thank you very much.
And again, this is why I decided to start these web jams, is because there is, as we see, people from all over the world, not that many, but I'm in touch with people in Turkey, in Germany, in Europe, in Russia. There is millions probably of people who are concerned about these issues who can now connect. And, and if 10% of the population manage,
right,
if each of us inspires 10 other people, then we have 100% of the population. So that's the hope. But we need to be realistic. What drives me nuts is people who say, well, I'm single, I don't have children, but I'm raising consciousness on the planet, and these people are well-meaning, right? But often they don't understand the difference between spiritual awareness, and call that consciousness, or psychological awareness, and real levels of consciousness. And secondly, they commit this fallacy of dissociating evolution of consciousness from biological evolution, and then hope that somehow the children that are born, in less conscious families, through their meditation or their their energy or their, whatever they do, their conscious raising activity somehow will then also evolve to their level of consciousness. And the statistics just don't bear that out. I mean, I think it's clear now that this is not working.
When you showed that, yeah.
It was a great idea. It didn't work. We need to move on to something else. It's that simple.
And that would maybe be related to sort of at the green level of consciousness, not being able to deal with quite enough complexity of what's going on, right? And or adapting across different contexts quickly enough or something like that.
You're a little broken up, so
okay.
For me, the first step would be that green and integral people acquire the skills to co-create healthy relationships at their level, and since the complexity of the individuals increases, right? The complexity of the relationships increases, but we don't really have the tools to deal with the complexity at the green and higher levels. And that's where I want to make a contribution with my work to provide the tools to deal with the increased complexity of relationships at that level.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I guess I don't have my microphone on. I'll go off now and let somebody else participate.
Well,
and
we are at 11 o'clock, so
okay. Oh, okay.
Good to see you, and let's stay in touch. And I'll contact you about one of the future sessions to have you on as an expert in personality disorders and stuff like that. I want to bring you on.
Okay. Oh, sounds great.
Thanks, Irvin.
Yeah. Okay.
As always.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
So thank you for participating. Have a great weekend, and hopefully I'll see you next Saturday, as I mentioned.